Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, we're going to try and visit a new channel today. This is called Fire of Learning. Some of you recommended them to me, and I thought I would start out with something I know a little something about and that I know is pretty popular here on the channel, and that is the topic of U.S. presidents. We're going to get into some more European history in the coming days and weeks, so I wanted to divert back to U.S. history just for today. And this particular video they have on their channel is called The Last Words and Cause of Death of Each President. Now, I know that my friend Mr. Beat also has a video about this topic, so I will link you not only to this original content creator on Fire of Learning, but I'll also put a link in the description to Mr. Beat's video on this topic, which I have not seen yet. But I just wanted to take a look at something a little different. So I don't think this has a lot of narration to it other than just some music, and it's just going to kind of talk about the last words and cause of death and the date of death and things like that of each of the U.S. presidents, and we'll stop and talk a little bit about each one as we go along. Let's dive in. Not a lot to George Washington's last words. "'Tis well." I always felt bad for the circumstances of George Washington's death. He dies 2.5 years after leaving office. All the man ever wanted was to be able to retire back to Mount Vernon in peace and live as a private citizen. He finally gets to do that after 8 years as president. He goes home and dies in his late 60s of something that today would be very curable, basically a throat infection. Some simple antibiotics today would have cured him. They tried to bleed him to treat it, and it may be that killed him. You're going to find that several of our U.S. presidents were probably hastened in their death by the treatments that were done on them by the doctors. And some of them, the cause of death to this day is not necessarily 100% for sure. He also had a real fear of being buried alive, which was something you occasionally heard about in this time, because embalming was not something that happened all the time in the 18th century. And so, a lot of times people would be buried soon after they died, and for one reason or another, they weren't actually dead. And they would find out years later when the person was exhumed or something that the person had actually been alive and woke up and there were scratch marks in the coffin, which is horrifying to think about. And George Washington was terrified of that. So he had, I think in his will, that they had to wait a certain number of days before they actually buried him. Yeah, and this one's pretty phenomenal. It's one of those things you wouldn't believe if it weren't actually true. I don't know if John Adams' actual very last words were "Thomas Jefferson survives," but they were among his last words for sure. We know that. He and Thomas Jefferson both died on July 24th, 1826, or July 4th, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the historic date of its adoption. Which is just amazing in and of itself. But then when you think about the fact that these guys had been friends and then rivals and then friends again at the end of their lives. Adams had been president when Jefferson was vice president. They ran against each other. So it's pretty fascinating to know that these men died hours apart. But he was actually wrong. He had actually outlived Jefferson by a few hours. But, until the 20th century, John Adams was our longest lived president. He was 90 years old when he died. And I think it was only like Herbert Hoover maybe that was the next one to live that long. And Jefferson, we've already talked about him. He did ask if it was the fourth. He had outlived most of his children and his wife. So he didn't have a lot of folks there with him other than slaves. Madison lived to be 85, so he lived quite long as well. Now, James Monroe is a little younger. He's 73 when he dies. Also dies on July 4th, 5 years to the day after Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. I believe the last president to die on the 4th of July. There have only been those three. Monroe was a one in a string of presidents who had been president after being Secretary of State. That was kind of a common jumping off point to becoming president. and the last of our founding fathers to be president. John Quincy Adams is kind of a cool story because he, and again, he lives to be 80 years old. Father and son president, both are the first two to only serve one term. Because the other presidents before and after them, Jefferson, George Washington, Madison, Monroe, Jackson, all served 2 terms, but John Quincy Adams and John Adams only serve 1 term each. But he goes back to the House of Representatives and becomes a congressman again after he was president. It's kind of fascinating when you think about Andrew Jackson. Of all the presidents that would be talking about, it would be good to meet each of you in heaven, be good children, all of you, and strive to be ready when the change comes. It just seems a very out of character thing for Andrew Jackson, but it seems like maybe he was being rather kind of, just kind of thinking about his life and thinking about eternity in that moment, I guess. There is but one reliance. I'm assuming he's talking about God, talking about Jesus, maybe. Interesting. Martin Van Buren is one of, I think, 2 presidents who died in 1862. John Tyler's the other one. Both of them died during the American Civil War. So you have Van Buren dying in the North, John Tyler dying in the South, one dying as an American, another dying as a member of the Confederate Congress. So William Henry Harrison is the first president to die in office, and contrary to popular belief, did not probably die as the result of giving a really long inaugural address without wearing a coat and catching a cold. Most modern folks believe today that he probably caught some kind of illness, probably from the drinking water in Washington, D.C. at the White House, where it was not real clean. And so you can see here he dies of typhoid, pneumonia, paratyphoid fever. There were several presidents who die of illness around that time. You have another one in Zachary Taylor, who may have died of similar causes. But shortest term, only serves 1 month in office. John Tyler, who, as of this moment, I believe still has 1 living grandson, which is nuts. When you think about the fact that the man was president in the 1840s, he was president 180 years ago, and he has a living grandson, and that is because he was married twice. His second wife, Julia Gardner, was much, much younger than he was. He had several children with her. I think he had like 16 kids altogether. And one of those sons that he had when he was in his 60s also had children very late in life. And it's one of those sons that's still alive. James Polk has one of my all-time favorite last words. I love you, Sarah, for all eternity. I love you. And he had only left office a few months after his presidency. As you can see there, was one of the youngest presidents that we ever had, and was one of the youngest to die. He's only 52 years old when he or 53 years old when he dies. He is buried on the grounds of the state capitol in Tennessee, in Nashville. One of 2 presidents buried in Nashville. The other one's Andrew Jackson. And there's Zachary Taylor. He's the next president to die in office. Dies. He's one of those generals that gets elected president. He's born in Kentucky, and only serves year and a half of his term, just over a year, and is succeeded by Millard Fillmore. And they, I should say about Zachary Taylor too, that they exhumed him a few years ago because there's been this ongoing speculation that he had been poisoned. And so they exhumed his body, and if you Google it, you can actually find images of Zachary Taylor's bones. A couple of those images actually got leaked, one of his skull, in fact. They exhumed him from his grave in Louisville, Kentucky, did some tests, reburied him, and nothing in the tests indicated that he had been poisoned. There's our Alec Baldwin look-alike, Millard Fillmore. Lives till 1874. He's buried in Buffalo, New York, I think. The nourishment is palatable, he says, referring to a bowl of soup. Boy, if you're thinking ahead to what do I want my last words to be, that's probably not high on the list. That tells me I'm thinking he might not have expected that those were going to be his last words. Yeah, Franklin Pierce, again, a young guy, only 49 when he's elected president. Dies in 1869, cirrhosis of the liver, drank himself to death. James Buchanan, O Lord God Almighty, as thou wilt. And so he dies not long after leaving office as well. He leaves office in 1861, dies in 68. There's a time there during, I believe it's during Ulysses S. Grant's administration, where there are no living ex-presidents. I'm trying to think if that's the case, because Andrew Johnson, I think, dies in 1875. Grant serves till 77. I think when Grant leaves office, he is the only living ex-president. I could be wrong about that, but I'm almost positive that's the case. And yeah, Lincoln's last words, let me see if they got those right. It was something to his wife. Yeah, she won't think anything of it. Clara Harris and Henry Rathbone are the couple who go to Ford's Theater with them. It was supposed to be Mr. and Mrs. Grant, but they decided to go to see their kids. And so Major Rathbone and Clara Harris go to the play with them. And Mrs. Lincoln makes some comment to Mr. Lincoln about the fact, what's she going to think about us, being so, showing our affection for one another publicly by holding hands. And he said, oh, she'll think nothing of it. And a few seconds later, he was shot. Be good children, and we shall meet in heaven. Also pretty young, 66 years old when he dies. So yeah, Grant lives till 1885. So from 1877, when he leaves office, he's the only living ex-president at that point. Very famously, and just a heroic thing on Grant's part, he had been swindled out of most of his savings late in life after he left office, and his family was broke, and they were in real trouble. And he knew he was dying of throat cancer about a year before, and he's finally convinced to write his memoirs. And so, in incredible pain from this cancer that is killing him, he hurries to write his memoirs, sometimes writing like 8 and 10 pages a day by hand, sitting on the porch. So much pain that he can't even swallow. And it burns like acid. He describes, that it burns like acid for him to even swallow anything. And he's just trying to get his memoirs done. And he gets them done like a week before he dies. And they set his family up for life because they make like hundreds of thousands of dollars for his family in the aftermath of his death. And they're really fantastic. I highly recommend Grant's memoirs. It's a really, really good read. Hayes dies of a heart attack, 70 years old. I know I am going where Lucy is. Thinking of his wife. Garfield lives for several months. He's shot in July, and he lives till September. And this is when I was referring to earlier when I said that that there were more than one president probably killed by their doctors. Garfield's another one. If his doctors had done nothing, I mean, if they had literally just sewed him back up after he was shot, he probably would have survived. But they started digging around, trying to find the bullet. The bullet ended up being lodged against his spine. They never did find it. They tried all these different things to try and find it. At one point, they brought in a metal detector, but he was laying on a bed with metal springs. And, they tried all this stuff, and they made the wound worse, and it got infected, and that's what killed him. If they had just left it alone, the body had actually created this like protective, sack around the bullet, and he probably would have been okay. And he's asking for help with the pain. Brilliant guy. Would have been one of our greatest presidents. Chester Arthur dies of a stroke, again, right after leaving office. One of many presidents who leave office and die soon after. Benjamin Harrison, and a lot of people don't think about this, he dies the same year that William McKinley is assassinated. 1901, William McKinley is assassinated a couple months later. Are the doctors here? Doctor, my lungs. He's dying of pneumonia. Cleveland lives till 1908. I have tried so hard to do right. That's a man kind of thinking back to his life. We are all going. God's will be done, not ours. Probably one of our most religious presidents, William McKinley. Please put out that light, James. A lot of people, I think Theodore Roosevelt's death came as a surprise. He was a young guy too. I mean, he was 60 years old when he died. Pulmonary embolism. Same thing, I think, that killed General Patton. Just one of those things you can't necessarily always account for that is caused by other health problems. And, he died in his sleep, I believe. And I think somebody made a comment about how death had to take him in his sleep because if he had been awake, there would have been a fight. And that sums up Theodore Roosevelt. Debility. I mean, just old age. I mean, he was Chief Justice when he died. He became Chief Justice after President. Stroke. When the machinery is broken, I am ready. And isn't that the case, man? I mean, that's how I feel too. I would love to live a long life, but not if the machinery is broken. If my body is not up to it, I'm ready to go. You know what I mean? So when that time comes. But he had a stroke while he was president, and so this is a second more serious stroke that happens later in life, a few years later. Warren G. Harding dies in office. That's good. Go on, read some more, to his wife. He dies just a couple months before Woodrow Wilson does. He was on a trip, I think, to San Francisco when he died. You can see Calvin Coolidge is another one that doesn't live very old. He's only 60 years old when he dies. Born on the 4th of July. Herbert Hoover, he lives to be 90. Dies in 1964, a good 31 years after he leaves office. That's during Johnson's administration. Of course, we know that Franklin Roosevelt died during his presidency. He talks about a terrific headache, which was that cerebral hemorrhage. A blood vessel has burst in his brain. Everybody, I think, that was around him knew he was dying at that point. He had gone down to Warm Springs, Georgia, which was a place that he frequented for most of his life, especially after he had polio and lost the use of his legs. Truman's another one that lives a long time, lives to be almost 90 years old. He's 88 when he dies. And there's a lot of and sometime we're going to have to look into those. I want to watch interviews with historic figures who live much longer than we realize. Like there's video of Helen Keller speaking, which is phenomenal in and of itself because she couldn't hear or see. There's video of the first female senator who died in like the 1930s, who had been a slave owner. There's video interviews of Civil War veterans. There's a lot of really great interviews with Dwight Eisenhower and Harry Truman that I would love to watch sometime. Eisenhower, dies in 1969, just 8 years after leaving office. I want to go. God take me. Yeah, so Natalie Connolly, I didn't realize that was her first name. She's the wife of Governor Connolly of Texas. They're sitting in the front, in front of Jackie and John Kennedy, who are sitting behind them. And she turns around, and you certainly can't say that the people of Dallas haven't given you a nice welcome, Mr. President. And said, no, you certainly can't. And a few seconds later, he gets hit, and you see him kind of reach up and grab his throat before the fatal wound happens. Send Mike immediately. He's only 64 when he dies. So, I mean, much younger than you realize, I think. Richard Nixon lived a long life. He's 81 years old. For all the things, whatever you want to say about him as president, I don't want to get into any of that. But something I will always remember is watching his wife's funeral, his wife, Pat Nixon. And the man was just broken. You could tell how broken he was over the loss of his wife. He was just a broken man. He was weeping. It was so very sad to watch him say goodbye to his wife, and he died not long after she did. Gerald Ford, our most recent president to die until George H.W. Bush a few years ago. And he's 93 years old when he died. Ronald Reagan, unfortunately, for the last years of his life, had dementia, Alzheimer's, and was not seen much in those final years of his life. Lived to be 93 years old. Most of our modern presidents have been living into their 90s now. Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter's in his 90s, man. He's doing amazing, even to this day. George H.W. Bush was in his 90s. Yep, 94. I love you too. Spoken to his son and fellow president George H.W. Bush, or George W. Bush. So there you have it. Let me know your thoughts about all of that. Add your own observations about what we just talked about, and if you have recommendations for what you'd like to see next, as far as reactions go, let me know, and we'll look into some of those. Thanks for watching.